Hello again. This is Annalisa Ventola, founder of Public Parapsychology, back to host this session with Dr. Jack Hunter. I am pleased to welcome him to this event. He will present Greening the Paranormal, an introduction to the ecology of extraordinary. So without further ado, Dr. Hunter, please begin your presentation.
Thank you very much. Well, yeah, thanks for inviting me. This is an amazing event, and I'm happy to be participating. I'm going to be talking about a book that I published in 2019 predominantly, but exploring some of the key themes that have spread out of that book. Okay, so this is where we're headed. So I'm going to introduce the book, Greening the Paranormal, and just explain a little bit what I mean by this term. Actually, I think you can use it in a few different ways. And then these are the three key themes. There are others in the book that can be explored, but these ones I thought would be the key for this presentation. So first of all, to think about the relationship between extraordinary experiences and ecology, then to explore this idea that I've been playing around with of biodiversity and psychodiversity being sort of two sides of the same coin, or actually the same coin. And the ecological self will be the place where we end, because I think this is one of the sort of meeting points of all of the different strands that we've been that we will be thinking about in this workshop, but also that were explored in Greening the Paranormal. And then I'll conclude. Okay. So just to briefly explain the book and how it came about, it is a very broad exploration of the links between ecology and anomalistics. And I've taken this idea of anomalistics really broadly. So it includes things like parapsychology, but it also brings in cryptozoology, other areas of paranormal research, as well as anthropology, religious studies, and indigenous perspectives on the spiritual and the ecological and the anomalous. So it's a very broad, very broad book, but there are key themes in there, I think, that are really pertinent. And you can get a sort of an idea of the breadth of the book by looking at the contributors, some of whom you might be familiar with and some of whom you might actually be, which is quite nice. All exploring these strands in different directions. Okay, so it's a very useful book, I think, for exploring this territory. Definitely as a starting place. And although it might seem at first glance that ecology and the paranormal are quite different kind of things, that they're quite, unrelated maybe, there are, as I've already said, a number of sort of strands that run right through it. They go right through, if we look at the history of paranormal research, we find these strands right back in the early days. We find these strands going way back into shamanism and animistic traditions as well. So these are deep, deep strands. And one of the main strands, or one of the most important, especially for thinking about the ways that this kind of research might contribute to, positive action or pro-environmental behavior, is through the fruits of paranormal experience. Through the effects that these experiences have, and we'll talk about that in a little while as well. But also the content of paranormal experiences often has a green or an ecological theme or dimension to it. And then there are the implications of paranormal experiences, especially in terms of thinking about the possibility of things like spirits of place and nature spirits, these kinds of things, and our deeper interconnectedness with all of these processes through the possibilities of psi. Okay, so there are many deep strands. Okay, so the first one that I want to focus in on is the relationship explicitly between extraordinary experiences of different kinds and ecology. This, and again, this is not a new idea. Like I said, these ideas of the role of ecology and extraordinary experiences go right back to the beginnings of when people first started to think about these things in scholarly terms. The scholar of mysticism, W.T. Stace, for example, spoke about two different kinds of mystical experiences. He talked about introverted experiences, which are mystical experiences where we go into ourselves and discover the oneness, unity, sense of connection with the cosmos internally. to things like meditation and whatever. And then on the other hand, and this was the other kind of key strand of mystical experiences from Stace's perspective, was the extrovertive experience, which is when the experience comes from the outside, or the experience seems to blur the lines between the external world and the internal world. And these experiences are often induced by participation in, rich ecosystems. I've got a nice example for you in a minute. Okay, so we've got introverted, interior experiences, visions, sensations of oneness, and these kinds of things. And then extroverted experiences. Okay, and one of the most interesting things about this, which also links it into the parapsychological dimension, is this idea that comes out of extroverted experiences that human beings are actually fundamentally interwoven and interconnected into these living systems that we're participating in. Okay, so they give rise to a sense of interconnection. But I think also one of the things that's most important and most interesting about extroverted experiences is that they also emphasize diversity. So often, introverted experiences seem to focus on the oneness and sensations of unity and things like that. But extroverted experiences also seem to have almost an animistic dimension to them, where individual trees and plants and things might take on, almost person-like characteristics in these experiences. So they are different to introverted experiences, but they're also connected in some way as well. Okay, so this is how Stace defines it. He says, the extroverted mystic with his physical senses continues to perceive the same world of trees and hills and tables and chairs as the rest of us, but he sees these objects transfigured in such manner that the unity shines through them. Okay, so it's both unity and diversity. And I think that's a really interesting point ecologically as well. Because when we look at the world from an ecological perspective, that's exactly what we see. The Earth as a single living system, for example, as suggested by the Gaia hypothesis, is constituted of many, many, many thousands of different parts. Okay, so something interesting going on here, that extroverted experience seems to resonate with ecological perspectives as well. And here's a particularly nice, I think, example of an extroverted experience from Sir Alister Hardy, founded the Religious Experience Research Centre. He said, there's no doubt as a boy I was becoming what might be described as a nature mystic. Somehow I felt the presence of something which was beyond and yet in a way part of all the things that thrilled me. The wildflowers and indeed the insects too. I'll now record something that I've never told anyone before, but now that I'm in my 88th year, I think I can admit it. Just occasionally, when I was sure that no one could see me, I became so overcome with the glory of the natural scene that for a moment or two I fell on my knees in prayer. Not prayer asking for anything, but thanking God, who felt very real to me, for the glories of his kingdom and for allowing me to feel them. And this is the crucial point here. It was always by the running waterside that I did this, perhaps in front of a great foam of meadowsweet or purple loosestrife. So again, participation in ecological systems seems to give rise to these extraordinary experiences, which bring about change in people. And it's perhaps no coincidence that, having had these experiences in childhood, that Alister Hardy went on to be a preeminent, marine biologist, as well as an investigator of religious experiences. Okay, so this is what we mean by the fruits of paranormal or extraordinary experiences. We get this term fruits from William James, who we're probably all familiar with. He suggested that one of the simplest ways of telling whether a religious experience was a genuine experience or not was whether the person had been morally and philosophically transformed following that experience. So if they'd had some kind of a real transformation in personality, then that suggested that there was some kind of genuine thing going on. Okay, so this was one of his key ways of determining whether an experience was a genuine experience or not by necessarily analyzing it in a laboratory or anything like that, but looking at its effects. Okay, so we can think about then the effects of the experience. Does it change behavior? And interestingly, there is quite a lot of research that points in the direction of all sorts of different kinds of paranormal or extraordinary experiences having the fruit of pro-environmental behavior. Okay, so Ring and Valerino, for example, found that near-death experiences often develop a heightened sensitivity to the ecological health of the planet. So following their experiences, of entering into this near-death state, whatever that might be, or whatever is going on there, they come back from the experience with a transformation of personality that makes them want to engage and be more aware of ecological issues. Okay, so that's super interesting. And we also find it with psychedelics as well. And that David Luke's work has been exploring this quite recently. Okay, but here's a little quote here. Lifetime experience with psychedelics in particular may contribute to people's pro-environmental behavior by changing their self-construal in terms of an incorporation of the natural world. So what they're suggesting is that, in these kinds of extraordinary experiences or psychedelic states, our sense of self changes and may actually broaden out and incorporate things, that not in our normal state of consciousness are not normally incorporated in ourself, that are separated off. Okay, so interesting threads that run through all sorts of extraordinary experiences, even through to very extreme kinds of, or we might call these high strangeness kinds of extraordinary experiences like alien abductions. So we've probably all heard about alien abductions as well. A person is taken aboard a flying saucer or some kind of a spacecraft, it might not be a spacecraft, taken somewhere anyway, and has strange procedures done on them by aliens. In the 1990s, the Harvard psychiatrist John Mack became very interested in these experiences as genuine experiences, in their own right, and not trying to necessarily explain them away, but to explore them. And one of the key themes that he detected amongst all of the, hundreds of abductees that he spoke with was the idea that the ecological crisis has got something to do with, or the emerging ecological crisis at that time, had something to do with these alien abductions. So he says it seems impossible to avoid the observation that the alien abduction phenomenon is occurring in the context of a planetary ecological crisis that is reaching critical proportions, and that information about this situation is often powerfully conveyed by the alien beings to the experiencers. So this is super strange as well. Why should these experiences have this ecological component? Very interesting. But it also clearly links them with near-death experiences, mystical experiences, psychedelic experiences as well. They all seem to bring about similar kinds of transformations. And there's a few different lines that we can think about this relationship, especially in the context of alien abductions. And one of the most interesting ones is a great story about the eco-psychologist Val Plumwood, who had she was attacked by an alligator or a crocodile, and while she was in the horror of its death, twists that they do, she obviously had an extraordinary experience. But after this horrible experience, she felt a much deeper sense of connection to the natural world. Not because the crocodile, and this is what I mean, like the aliens, for example, not because the crocodile necessarily intended that, but because the crocodile actually made her realize that she was still a part of the ecosystem. So I find it quite difficult to think that all of these abduction experiences are necessarily positive experiences, because they're very often very frightening. But it could be that they're simply, people are being snapped out of their comfort zone and put into a broader ecological framework. You realize that actually you could be prey. You're not the apex predator anymore. Or another angle could be that actually paranormal experiences are more common in particular kind of states of consciousness, which you might think of as maybe ecological consciousness. And we'll explore that later on as well. Okay, but what is clear is that there's some kind of a feedback loop here, not with everyone, of course, but in the cases where these experiences do occur, some kind of a feedback loop related to, first of all, interaction with the natural world, in the way that, say, Alister Hardy as a child interacted with the meadows, and that this kind of interaction gives rise to extraordinary experiences. And there's also lots of research on extreme sports and things like that, surfing and mountain climbing and all sorts of things like that, which have similar kinds of extraordinary phenomenological features, but that also give rise to this sense of nature connection as well. Okay, so interacting with the world seems to give rise to extraordinary experiences, and extraordinary experiences like psychedelic experiences, near-death experiences, and abduction experiences also seem to give rise to pro-environmental behaviors. Okay, so this is, I think, in terms of thinking about practical applications of paranormal, psi, or extraordinary experience research, this is an interesting point because it's possible that there might actually be fruits that can be grown from this. I won't read this quotation now, but it's a very interesting quotation about the role of dowsing in actually focusing our attention into a particular place. Okay. Right. The second key theme I want to think about is biodiversity and psychodiversity. So as Annalisa was telling us before, surveying what we mean by the climate and ecological crisis, biodiversity loss is one of the key kind of features of what's going on. And we're actually in, like the sixth mass extinction event, comparable to the end of the dinosaurs and these kinds of things is going on right now. And in the last 50, 60 years, we've literally lost like almost 50% of the Earth's biodiversity, okay, which is crazy. This has got big impacts on the physical parts of the Earth system, obviously. Biodiversity is plants and animals and all sorts of bacteria and things like that, which all contribute to the cycles that are going on. And we're well aware of the value of trees, for example, for our atmosphere and the role that they play. So, when we talk about planting trees from a political point of view, as is the case at the moment, there's big pushes to plant trees. We're thinking about it in terms really of biomass. That trees are just biological things that perform a function for us, which is to repair the damage that we've done, essentially. But increasingly, research is suggesting that even things, like plants, for example, things that in Western context, particularly, we've usually really taken for granted, thought of as the very lowest level in terms of evolution, of organisms. These can't move around, they can't talk, they can't blah, 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 all of this kind of stuff. But increasingly, research is showing that plants have got much deeper capabilities than we've given them credit for. Okay, so Mancuso and Viola have a great book about the history of research on plant intelligence. And they say that the study of plant intelligence points out a very interesting aspect of research on intelligence in general, how difficult it is for us humans to understand living systems that think differently from us. Indeed, we only seem able to appreciate intelligence as very similar to ours. So we find it easy, or easier. In fact, actually human beings have had problems historically with detecting, personhood in other human beings. So maybe we're not that good at this. But we can pick it up in animals, the animals that we engage with. But we're much less likely to pick up or to think about the intelligence of plants because they're very different to us. Okay, and then they go on to say that actually a compelling body of research shows that higher order plants really are intelligent, able to receive signals from their environment, process the information, devise solutions adapted to their own survival. What's more, they manifest a kind of swarm intelligence that enables them to behave not as an individual, but as a multitude. Okay, so there's some very interesting things in here as well that seem to connect into, what we might think of as psi. How do these plants, for instance, have a swarm intelligence? It also suggests that plants might have an ecological self, which we'll talk about in a minute. Okay, so this is super interesting, but at the very least, it's suggesting that plants are much more than just biomass. Monica Gagliano's recent work as well is really pointing in this direction. Her book, Thus Spoke the Plant, is definitely a must read, especially in the way that it blends together this experiential, almost shamanistic approach to plant intelligence, and the scientific laboratory-based approach. Okay, but her research has shown all sorts of interesting things about plants, that they're actually capable of learning and remembering. This is super interesting because plants don't have neurons like humans do, for example. And the standard argument is that we are storing our memories in our brains somewhere, but plants don't actually have brains in the sense that we do. So there's some interesting stuff there which may have psi or a parapsychological relevance. Plants have got the capacity to hear sounds. Even more interestingly as well, they might actually use sound to communicate with each other. They found that plants can make small sort of clicking sounds with their bodies. The soil is actually a really good medium for transmitting sound, so it's kind of ideal for them. And all of this is helping to crystallize what's becoming known as plant neurobiology, strangely called neurobiology because plants don't really have neurons, like I've already said. But it's a whole new field that's emerging to suggest that plants have got this, maybe a subjective dimension to them. So when we're talking about biomass and we're talking about reforesting and rewilding and things like that, we're also talking about putting minds into the world, fostering minds, allowing other forms of non-human intelligence to flourish and do their thing. And these non-human minds are kind of actually throughout nature. Increasingly, there's been research, in things that human beings have thought of as very distinctively human. So things like culture, for example, and tool use and all of these kinds of things. But the more that we engage in observation of non-human animals, the more that we see these characteristics, emerging. Okay, so there's evidence of socially learned culture, of culture that has been handed from one generation to the next in the way that human beings do, for example, amongst humans, of course, but plus a handful of species of birds, 1 or 2 whales, 2 species of fish. That was in 2003. I should imagine that that's expanded a bit further by now. Some interesting recent research on bats to show that they have different, between, different communities of bats, they have different, basically song cultures, and they have different interests. Okay, so there are, different communities have got different cultures, different ways of living in the world. And this is the crucial point here. When you have pronounced cultural differences like this between populations of species or between species, losing populations is tragic because you're losing these animals' cultures that have been built up over many years. And these animal cultures, may hold all sorts of different kinds of solutions to specific problems that are unique to their ecological niches. For them, like things like mating preferences as well. But what if we could learn from this? We're losing actually our ability to learn from it with the loss of biodiversity. Okay, so the point I wanted to make here was that when we're thinking about biodiversity, we're also talking about psychodiversity. Biodiversity is and mind, or mind and matter really are 2 sides of the same thing. So when we're talking about populations of animals, we're talking also about cultures, beliefs, worldviews, all of these kinds of things. So it really needs to be considered. And if we're talking about consciousness-based applications for climate action, then I think that we need to broaden our understanding of consciousness beyond the human, because it's not just human beings that are engaged in this or participating in this world. In fact, it's some people have suggested that actually it's our anthropocentrism that's led us down this route. So perhaps one of the avenues for escaping it is by deliberately making an effort to be non-anthropocentric and to consider all of this other variety of mind, culture, consciousness, and that kind of thing. Okay. So the last theme that I wanted to mention is the ecological self. And this is a concept that comes from deep ecology, really, but has been developed through eco-psychology. And I like to think of the ecological self as, in terms of this Venn diagram, kind of bringing together lots of different strands of research. So, for example, research in parapsychology, which suggests, that psi capacities are more prevalent in certain kinds of altered states of consciousness, for example, where our boundaries dissolve, boundaries between self and other, for example, or between self and the world seem to dissolve. Okay, which sounds very like what the deep ecologists talk about when they talk about the ecological self, a self or an understanding of the self that incorporates not just our individual person, but other things in the environment around us. And also anthropology, which has for a long time been aware of the fact that there are different forms of the self within human populations. They talk very broadly about Western and non-Western self. These are probably not the correct terms to use really to talk about this, because you can have individual selfhood in non-Western contexts just as much as you can have the opposite, individual selfhood, in Western contexts. Okay, but they have recognized this, and that many indigenous societies, for instance, and there's been a lot of talk about looking to indigenous societies as sort of examples of ecological living. They also have this more individual idea of the self, that the self is made up of many parts, that it might contain elements of the environment, or that it might contain parts of other people or spirits as well. Okay, so all of these things come together. So I'll just explain a little bit about the ecological self to wrap up. So it comes from the work of Arne Naess. He was the founder of the deep ecology movement. He was a philosopher, initially kind of like quite a dry kind of philosopher, who then became involved in ecology. And he talked about this process of self-realization. And the idea is that we should move, we're learning about ourselves as we go through our lives, but eventually we will move away from the egoic idea of the self as being an individual bounded thing towards what he called this ecological self, which contains not just the individual, but also these other things around us. He didn't give a solid definition of it, but he does give some kind of sentences, which I think suggest more that it's a process rather than any kind of definition. It's a process that you have to go through. He says, the ecological self of a person is that with which this person identifies. So you can see here, like in psychedelic states, for example, when people report identifying with a table or something like that, or a rock or a chair or a tree. This is a we could think of as a kind of an ecological self, where the boundaries are falling down or dissolving. Okay, he goes on. This key sentence, rather than a definition about the self, shifts the burden of clarification from the term self, because what is the self, to actually that of identification. So actually, what do people identify with? Do they identify with just the physical body, or do people identify with other things around them as well? The environment that they live in, the food that they eat, the relationships that they engage in, and all of that kind of stuff. And all of that is what anthropologists refer to as the non-Western individual self. Okay, so he's suggesting that the ecological self emerges when we identify the environment with ourselves. The philosopher Freya Matthews gives us some more depth. She wrote a whole book on the ecological self. And she describes an interesting way of thinking about this sort of interconnected network, where the self is just a sort of a node in all sorts of different kinds of physical and non-physical processes. So she describes it as a holistic nesting of a self in a wider self system. So the self is, part of a bigger system, which itself is probably part of bigger systems going all the way out. Means a relative identification with that system. Because the self stands in relations of ecological interdependence, direct or indirect, with the elements of that wider self, those elements or its relations to them are logically involved in its identity. So this is what Arne Naess is saying. When you recognize this, that the other elements of the world around us are also a part of yourself, and that is the ecological self. And she goes on, individuality in this framework is thus a relative matter. It's a function of involvement in a wider system, the identity of which is implicated in the identities of each of its participant subsystems. The individual is thus, in a very real sense, a microcosm of the wider self in which it occurs. So we get this image of a vast interconnected system, many selves, which is pretty cool. And then the last little definition I want to look at is Joanna Macy's. She's one of the kind of key voices in eco-psychology. She says, once we tune into our interconnectedness, responsibility towards self and other become indistinguishable. Because if we identify, as Arnie Ness says, the forest with ourselves, then actually, doing damage to the forest is doing damage to ourselves. Okay, she said, just as an amputee continues to feel twinges in the severed limb, so in a sense do we experience in anguish for homeless people or hunted whales, pain that belongs to a separated part of our body, a larger body that we thought we had than we thought we had, unbounded by our skin. So actually we feel this pain from our wider body, in our sadness, for example, about the destruction of forests. So just to bring this into parapsychology a little bit more, William Broad gave a really useful kind of, kind of summary or exploration of where psi and the ecological self might come together. Okay, he says, psi events suggest that these limited identities, so ourselves, our individual selves, may be quirks of an unnecessarily limited and habituated attention, self-perception and self-conception. Such an individual self-concept may be to a large extent culturally conditioned, because even without considering psi events, we can find in other cultures greater identifications with others, so with our extended families, with one's community, one's ancestors, and with aspects of the natural world. Even within a Western Eurocentric culture, we experience expansions of self-identity beyond their usual bounds and certain non-ordinary conditions of consciousness. So he's really bringing all of this anthropological, parapsychological, and deep ecological together there. The psi phenomena that we observe appear to require and to reveal this interconnectedness. This connectedness seems more subtle, more extensive, and more profound than other more familiar conventional forms. Okay, so really he's saying that psi or parapsychological research is also pointing in the direction of the same thing that ecology points out, really, that we are part of, and in many more ways than we are maybe even consciously aware of, a broader system beyond ourselves. Okay, so here's my concluding points then. First of all, that extraordinary experiences have long been recognized as having an ecological component. So people like W.T. Stace, talked about extrovertive experiences in nature, for example. The threads that run through it are not just in terms of the content of the experiences, although that's there as well, like we saw in with alien abductions, but also because ecological systems seem to trigger and inspire extraordinary experiences. So if we want to bring about those kind of other changes, those other fruits of pro-environmental behavior, then maybe actually what we need is more engagement with the environment, more participation in the world around us, which gives rise to extraordinary experiences, which makes us more engaged. Okay, so participation in ecological systems gives rise to these experiences, and these encourage deeper participation. This is the feedback loop. And we've seen also as well that other kinds of extraordinary experiences also seem to lead to this. So actually, I think this is an important area for future study, or actually study right now, because it's critical. Okay, the ecological self then might actually be this point of connection between anthropology, parapsychology, and deep ecology. All of it suggests, as well as psi, that we're living in this kind of interconnected cosmos. Yeah, and that our individual well-being is dependent upon all of the well-being of the whole system, really. So again, this is the ecological self. If we want to self-preserve, then we have to other-preserve as well. Okay. So if the ecological self is this central feature of all of these things, then it might help us to understand why all sorts of different extraordinary experiences give rise to similar kinds of effects, because in all of them in some way might be related to at the extent to which we are understanding our connection or perceiving our connection with the world around us. And then the final point is that if we're taking a consciousness-based approach to the climate or ecological crisis, then we should also be adopting a much broader understanding of consciousness, not just human consciousness, but also many different kinds of non-human consciousness as well. Because if we leave that out of the equation, then, well, it's not great. And there's some references. There we go.
All right, thank you, Dr. Hunter. That was fantastic. So I'm going to invite you to go ahead and, well, we can leave the references up for a moment, but in a moment or two, you can close your slides. And I want to invite everybody to put their questions in the Q&A. And it looks like people have already gotten a head start. So I have a couple things to ask already that have already been upvoted. So at the top, and you've talked about this a little bit, but I guess I want to see the main points again. So if Mark Crewson asks, if you were to look at your entire body of research coupled with life experience, what top 3 suggestions would you have for how we improve the current situation in regards to climate change? These suggestions would be based on order of impact.
Yeah. Well, the first one I would suggest, the most important one, is participate and engage in the world around us. But the way that we do that, and this is kind of like a permaculture thinking, in permaculture, you want every kind of thing that you do to have multiple outputs and multiple yields. So, for example, a really great way of participating in the world is through something like gardening, and gardening has got a very direct impact on all of this stuff because it enhances biodiversity. So if you create an abundant garden with all different forms of life in it, then you're creating habitat, you're participating, you're giving yourself the opportunity to have extraordinary experiences of different kinds. You're giving yourself the opportunity to engage with other forms of mind and consciousness, and you're also nurturing other forms of mind and consciousness. So I think, very practical, hands-on things like gardening also have this spiritual or psi or ecological dimension. That's not 3 things, but that'll do.
Okay, I'll accept that. This question comes from Michael Totaro. It says, Dr. Hunter, what are some top contenders for methods in which to strengthen the unity between human, individual, and ecological consciousness?
Well, I think, a similar kind of thing to what I just said about participation and interaction with the world. Because, we for the most part experience ourselves as an individual, but when we engage in relationships with things, then that starts to break down and we start to experience, maybe see things of maybe ourselves in other things. So I think, like, for instance, taking the time to look at rocks, for instance, or to sit with trees, in the garden, and just take the time to don't expect as well some kind of super extraordinary experience. It's subtle.
So I have to thank you for introducing me to the book Thus Spoke the Plant, which you discussed earlier, and I read that with great. That was a page turner for me.
Yeah.
I had a lot of fun with that book, and I can't remember if you talked about this in your presentation, but I feel like she doesn't use the word psi, but I feel like there were some psi processes that she used to be successful as a plant biologist, and she goes into this in great detail. That relates to a question from Margaret Moga. And she says, maybe animals use a group mind consciousness while humans insist on individual consciousness and verbal speech. Maybe we need to develop group mind communication, not just with nature, but also with fellow humans.
Yeah, exactly. And this, like Monica Gagliano's experience, she basically, I'll explain what she did. She would do what they call like a dieta or dieta. You'd basically go and sit with a tree, and only you'd have you would fast but you might consume parts of the tree or bits of the bark and things like that. So it's a very close and intimate relationship with a particular entity. And through those experiences, the tree seemed to communicate to her novel approaches to experimental designs that she could use to demonstrate that trees or plants can communicate, for instance, or that they have memory. So it's a real interesting idea that actually scientific research can be a collaborative kind of process. We see it in the social sciences, in anthropology especially, that when you're creating an ethnography, it's not just your thing, it is a collaborative process. But we see it a lot less in sciences, and especially when I think of things like biology, where actually a lot of time is spent killing lab mice and things like that, because they only need them for a certain amount of time or for a certain generation, and it just seems like such a very the wrong way of doing things. So I think, much more of a sort of a collaborative approach to research with non-humans as well as with humans would be a way to go.
Do you have any thoughts on the practice of remote viewing as a tool for discovery of the ecological self?
Yeah, I think remote viewing is a great example of the ecological self, but it actually going beyond even necessarily, the physical world and into other things as well, other places. Because that's the other part of this, if we're using this ecological model to think about things, what it does is emphasizes, diversity and interconnectedness. And I think that probably that runs through on many levels as well, not just in terms of our physical reality, but also in terms of, higher dimensions and that kind of thing. And I know a lot of some remote viewing is seems to be very grounded in this world, and other kinds of remote viewing seem to be picking up on other even weirder stuff. And again, might be pointing in the direction of much more multiplicity in the cosmos, many worlds maybe. Just some thoughts.
All right, this is the last question we're going to have time for. This comes from Gene. He says, I read from time to time that something called global consciousness is rising, but don't notice it locally. Are you noticing anything along this line? And if so, where?
Yeah. Well, there's this interesting thing that's happening, especially in the world now. We've seen, in the last 3-4 years, with the activities of people like Extinction Rebellion and also Greta Thunberg, all of this kind of activity is boosting the signal in some way, isn't it? And I also think another thing that points in the direction of consciousness moving in the right direction is the emergence of sort of like community gardening projects, community food resilience projects and things like that, some of which I've been involved in my local area. So I've actually seen that there is some of this stuff going on. But it's not just in this local area. And when you think about the possibility that, these things are going on all over the world simultaneously, not necessarily directed from the top down, from government organizations, but from people, individuals or communities taking the initiative themselves, then the potential for a wider kind of impact kind of becomes clear, doesn't it? If many people start to move in that direction individually, then a bigger change can happen. A very kind of permaculture way of thinking.
All right. Well, thank you for joining us today. We are a little over time, but we're going to catch up. Our next talk is going to be with Alex Alvarez. And then after that, we have a networking break. And one thing we're going to do is during that networking break, we're going to set up a table that is titled Greening the Paranormal. And Jack, certainly you're invited to sit down at it. But anybody who wants to talk about, some of the items that have been discussed during this lecture should stick around for that networking break to sit down and talk about it as a small group. Anyhow, that's it for our session today, and we will be back just as soon as possible. In the meantime, feel free to sneak a few moments in the social lounge. We'll see you real soon.